everybody. Welcome to That Expert Show, where you help run the show. I'm Anna Canzano. Thanks so much for being with us today. Our topic today is aging parents, how to care for aging parents, how to care for aging loved ones. It is a journey fraught with twists and turns and can be, frankly, heartbreaking and overwhelming to know what is the right decision to make at the right juncture. Our expert today has spent 20 years in senior care, both personally and professionally. Her own mother was diagnosed with diabetes at a fairly young age, and that led to blindness and kidney failure. It really prompted our guest to go on and establish her own in-home care service, which taught her a tremendous, great deal about caring for other people's loved ones. And she went on to author the book, The Devoted Daughter, which really is a comprehensive guide, a resource for how to care for your loved ones. Joining us live is Kelli Bradley. Kelli, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
I think potentially the toughest thing with caring for your loved one is knowing when to start having that conversation, because it would stand to reason that you don't want to have the conversation with your aging parent about how they want to be cared for in their later years when crisis is striking.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I want to stress with your listeners is over 40% of people don't ever plan on having that conversation. And if I can encourage you guys to do one thing today, please start the conversation as soon as possible. I know it's a difficult one, but even icebreakers or just little tidbits why people do have their wits about them, just saying, Mom, if something happened to Dad, what would your wishes be? Just little bits and pieces. And the number one reason that people cite for not having the conversation is the fear of getting the door slammed in their face or being told it's none of your business. And honestly, that could happen, but you just have to keep at it. It's one of those things that no one ever teaches us how to do this.
Well, and I think if there's siblings in the family, you kind of have to figure out maybe if there's one sibling that is better than the others to have that conversation. They may have a different relationship with the parents.
Right. And, think about this too, Anna. By the time you get to the place where you're going to have the talk with your parents, you've processed that. You've thought about it. You've talked to your siblings. You've talked to your friends and maybe other family members. But if you come in kind of, like a bulldozer with your folks and say, hey, we've all come together and we decided this is what is best for you guys. They haven't processed it. Maybe they think it's fine. So that can be a really tough spot. And I always say to people, when you do this, leave judgment at the door. Because no matter what, I think as human beings, we all want to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you're going to have that conversation and as you're observing your parents, is there a framework within which you can be assessing their abilities? Like I'm thinking about, whether they're okay driving at night, whether they're okay going to the grocery store on their own or getting to doctor's appointments and keeping doctor's appointments, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's a great question. We have a lot of checklists and resources on our website, thedevotedDaughter.com. But what tends to happen is we are short on time, so we race over to our parents' house and we just kind of do things for them. Oh, I just am going to the grocery store. I'm going to do this. But we don't spend a lot of time doing what you just said, and that's observing. So I want people to really think about what were things like a year ago with your parents? What were they like 6 months ago? And what are they like today? And establish those baselines so that you really can start to assess where the gaps are and where they might need help.
Interesting. And then the financial aspect of this too, and maybe this is a question for later in our interview, but I heard from so many people on Facebook, for example, when I posted about this topic, that were concerned about protecting the financial interests of parents from caregivers or even siblings that might have the wrong intentions when it comes to the resources that the parents have.
Yep. And that goes back to our first point, which is it's never too soon to start having this conversation. And I would suggest getting in touch with an elder care attorney, or if you have an attorney that you work with, any ethical attorney will give you good advice and say, this is the path you need to take to protect yourself and your parents. And it's just something we need to talk about. And even if your folks don't want to talk about it openly with their kids, get them in front of an attorney so that they can plan for themselves while they have the ability to do so.
One question came in via LinkedIn, and Greg is wanting to know, how do you help them when they furiously refuse help?
Yeah, and this comes up so often. First of all, you start early, but I think secondly, going back to what we were chatting about, is you really got to realize where they are in this process. If they've never thought about this before, you've got to give them some space and time. And it may be baby steps. And I know that can be frustrating for people. It's like, I can see that they need help now, and I feel like they could use help 5 days a week. But if they're not going to accept that, you've got to kind of just ease your way in slowly. And even doing things like, if you're concerned about driving, that you just mentioned a moment ago, Anna, a rideshare service. Maybe they're not familiar with Uber. Maybe you could go together with them, doing things together and trying to get them warmed up to having help, even if it's from a family member. And, some folks will continue to resist and continue to resist. But I encourage you not to give up and just continue to try different things.
A lot of people who chimed in on this topic were talking about parents who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's or had other memory care issues, even from the age of 50 or 60 and on. Is there particular advice that you have for folks that are dealing with that? Because that can be a wholly different challenge in itself.
Yeah, that is a completely different animal. But one of the things that I want folks to remember is that dementia is a syndrome, and Alzheimer's is just the most common form of dementia. There are many, many different types. So it's really important to get a diagnosis and get some guidance from a qualified physician or neurologist on this. And then you can kind of start the process, because dementia, the syndrome, depending on the type, does go through some pretty clear steps and outlines. But I think one of the most difficult phases that I've seen in my caregiving business and personally with my dad is that place where, don't tell me what to do, I know what I'm doing. They just get that wall up and they know enough to do old familiar tasks well. Mm-hmm. But if you throw something new in there, it's kind of game over, and they get angry and confused and embarrassed. Mm-hmm. So I do have a tip around that space. One of the things that I ask people to do is get your 5 I'm sorry's down. I'm sorry, Mom. I know this is so hard. I'm sorry I spoke to you that way. I am so sorry. But you have to mean it or you're going to get caught. So think about those things in advance. And that's something that's so easy to do because it is hard. It's like you're losing your parent right before your eyes. They're still there, but they're not who they used to be.
Yeah, I mean, it can be argued that, if they're physically intact, but they're losing their mind, I don't know that one is worse. If they are, physically falling apart, but still have their wits about them, I think both come with their own set of, own version of heartbreak. I think that caring for an aging parent can often be an isolation feeling. A lot of people who weighed in said, they felt incredibly alone taking care of their parent. They had siblings, but the siblings weren't willing to do much or not willing to do anything, and it can lead to a lot of family disagreements. What advice do you have on that aspect of the caregiver trying to care for themselves?
Well, I think one of the big things is find an accountability partner. Find someone who doesn't give up on you. And if that's one of your girlfriends who just calls you every Tuesday and says, hey, Kelli, would you like to go to coffee today? And you go, no, I can't, I'm too busy. Or no, I'm at my mom's or whatever. And they just keep calling and calling. Or, find a coach of some sort, what I did is I signed up for a personal trainer. So I had some accountability to myself. I paid for something. It was like, wow, I need to be there at 10 a.m. to meet this woman. And that really helped break up my routine. Like, what was going to happen in an hour? And I think sometimes it's just that overwhelming, like, I can't do another thing. But if it's pre-planned and you've processed it and thought about it and made that commitment to yourself, it's much more likely to happen.
That's interesting because, I think this is an issue that's affecting not only people in their 40s and 50s with aging parents, but there are young people with aging loved ones that need to be cared for.
Mm-hmm.
And, before you know it, you have kind of bowed out of a lot of social things that you might have done before simply because you are being the devoted child to take care of your parent who needs help.
Well, and one thing that happened to me, and it caused me to bow out sometimes, was because I spent so much time with my mom and caring for her, and she was so medically complex, it required a lot. But when I would go somewhere, the first thing they'd say is, "Oh, it's great to see you. How's your mom?" I was like, "She's good." But I didn't really want to talk about that. I just wanted to be normal. You just kind of want to find that normal again. And it takes time.
Yeah, you can definitely get caught up in, it being the only thing that you're focused on in life. How do you deal with it when you have siblings who, are disagreeing with you on the type of care that you're offering, or siblings who are uncooperative and not lending much help to the process?
Well, I guess you have to pick your battles. And what we tried to do in our family was look at the strengths of each individual. But I was fortunate because we were all able to work together. If you can't work together, there may be some people that just don't need to be involved. But we often think of caregiving, or maybe the oldest child in the family or the person who's the most financially successful, that they have to take on the burden of it. But there's a lot more to it. There's maybe just the companionship aspect of it, or cooking a meal, or transportation. I mean, there's so many other things that play into this. Maybe being an advocate and representing mom or dad at the doctor's office or at the lawyer's, or, just making sure that they're safe at home and they're not being scammed, or the telephone is a great place that people try to kind of get in on seniors. There's all these different ways that we can advocate and support our families. And you just have to look at who's good at what. And skills may change over time too. Maybe your sister is really busy right now because she has little kids, but in a couple of years she has more time to dedicate to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like one person might be good at, setting up the finances, another might be good at cooking a meal, and you gotta play to everybody's natural strengths and what they bring to the table.
Exactly.
So what about the only child? Because that can be so hard. You don't have siblings to rely on to help and chip in this process.
Yeah. And we have a program that we call the Circles of Care, and it's about developing that support system. And for me, there were a lot of people in my mom's life that I really didn't think were going to be there. I didn't even realize it until they actually showed up. So for so many of us, we think, oh, we're alone, we don't have anyone. But you really just have to start becoming aware and start seeing who your parents are interacting with. How are they interacting in their community? Do they have community organizations? Do they have a faith organization? Is there a service in your town? Are there people that they interact with more casually that might agree to step in? And then you've got to nurture those folks. And I hate to add another task onto people's plates, but if they don't know you need help, they're not going to be there.
That makes sense. So, I mean, that can be as simple as, figuring out who are their neighbors and friends. And in the past, I know I've started to kind of collect phone numbers and even become Facebook friends with my mom's friends, just so I know that I know who these people are and can reach out to them. I can call her neighbor if I have questions or need her help doing something for my mom that I'm not physically there to do because I don't live in the same city. I live 5 hours away from her.
Yeah, it's just you just kind of start gathering intelligence like a detective and, putting all that information in one place. And, another thing you can do for them is gather that intelligence for them as well. So you're building kind of a support system maybe on their phone. You could start to program some of their contacts or program a list for them and say, like, here are the key contacts, mom, right here on your phone.
Now, so this is all talking about, ideally when your parents are still able to live in their own home. But let's talk a little bit about the process of having to get them either help in home, which can be costly, or going to a facility where they get some kind of assistance in their daily needs. Can we talk about the difference in cost, in-home care versus a facility?
Sure. In-home care and in-home care is non-medical care. Sometimes it gets confused with home health. Home health has physicians and nurses, physical therapists, and occupational therapists, and is typically prescribed by a doctor and covered by most insurance. So just wanted to separate those two. Home In-home care runs between 18 and 35 an hour approximately across the U.S., so the costs vary pretty significantly. Facilities there are different levels of care. So you'll hear the word independent living, which essentially means kind of got a senior apartment building that has transportation and meal services and not much more than that. And then you have, and that can be anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 a month. And then you've got assisted care where you have a little bit more support, maybe medication help, maybe help with a bath, that kind of thing. Walking assistance, dressing assistance, and that can go up to $6,000 to $8,000 a month, just depending on where you are in the country and what you're choosing. The other thing that I want folks to know is that when you're getting additional services from these places, there's usually a base price, and then they add what's called points on top of that, which basically equals dollars. So the more hands-on help you require, the more you're going to pay.
And so ideally, I mean, you said that like with the healthcare, insurance covers some or most of that, but a lot of these costs, I mean, hopefully your parents have set aside some kind of nest egg to pay for their own care in the later stages of life.
Yeah, because insurance, just to be clear, in-home care is typically not covered. Medicaid does not cover that. Medicare does. So you really need to look at what you've got. Medicare, will also not typically cover assisted living or memory care unless you have an Advantage program that specifically speaks to that. If you've got a long-term care policy, which is a separate policy, that will cover some of those costs. So as you're doing this investigation and gathering this information about your folks, you really need to understand what kind of insurance they have.
Well, and can you even purchase long-term policy after a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, for example, has been issued?
No.
Right, because the insurance companies are in the business of making money, so that does have to be a conversation you have well in advance.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of these policies, especially for older folks, they've got them socked away and they've had them for years and years. So it's really important to dig that out, figure out what's covered and what isn't. The terminology in many of the policies has changed, so you need to call them and find out, what do I do in case something happens? What's covered? A lot of times there'll be holdout periods. So there's just a lot of little details that need to be addressed there.
What's a holdout period?
It's just a waiting period. So if, for example, I need in-home care tomorrow, but I have a 30-day waiting period, then I have to pay out of pocket for the first 30 days.
Gotcha. And I think, with all of these costs, healthcare being what it is, costing so much, I think a lot of people may be tempted to go on the cheap and just say, hey, I know this lady from work and her sister used to be a nurse and I can just hire her privately for $15 an hour to go, help me out with mom or dad and their needs. That can be very tempting.
And it is tempting, but I'll tell you, I owned and operated an in-home care company for 11 years and hired hundreds of people. And if you hire someone privately, you need to put your employer hat on. And what does that mean? That means you've got to pay workman's comp, you've got to pay payroll taxes, you've got to file their taxes. You have to follow all the rules in your state for employers, and you have to understand both your state and the federal rules and how you apply those rules to your employee. So it gets a little bit more complex, and what might seem like $15 an hour can turn into $30 an hour pretty quickly.
And people might try to skirt that by just paying somebody under the table, right, in cash or other means. But you're saying that you're exposing yourself either way to liability, because whether you're official or not, they're in your parents' home, they're your employee.
And what happens if they slip and break their leg on the driveway? You're responsible for that. So it's just something to consider. It's not. And what happens if they don't show up, or they quit unexpectedly, and all of a sudden you counted on having this person there, and they just, they're missing in action? Then what do you do?
And that's where having the umbrella of an actual service that has multiple employees and can mitigate those circumstances might be beneficial. So what happens when, okay, it's obvious that mom or dad needs to go into facility, and you're not just going to pick one out of the blue. You're going to hopefully visit 3, 4, or 5 and make some evaluations and make that decision, hopefully with them if they've got their wits about them. What are things that you should be looking for when you go into a care facility? What are red flags? What are good things?
So I think before you even start the process, you need to figure out what you want. What are your goals? What do your parents want? What are they looking for? And that'll kind of guide you down that path. I often have said to people, not everyone is a cruise ship person. So not everybody is looking for bingo and activities and this and that and the other thing. I know, and my gram was just like, well, it's fine if you like this type of living. I mean, she just wasn't interested in that at all. So you have to really figure out if that's important to them. And if it is, that will start to guide you, point you in the right direction. But then you have to visit. And I would encourage you can't just visit once. You really need to visit at different times of the day, different days of the week. You need to find out what their staffing ratios are. So, and that might vary. Usually is different during the day, night, and weekend. But I would ask those questions. I would also check the Aging and Disability website in your state to make sure that there aren't any complaints. You want to check that out. And if your parent needs medications or medication services, find out how that process works, because that can be a place that can really cause major healthcare problems. So how is that documented? How are those medications stored? How are they delivered to the clients? What does that look like? And also, if they do need extra help like bathing and dressing and that kind of thing, how does that happen? What's the schedule, etc.? If it smells bad, that would be a big red flag for me.
Just when you go in and you're smelling either a bad smell or whatever funny smell they've generated to cover up the bad smell.
Yeah. And the other thing that's a red flag for me is that I've been in a lot of these places, and when you go into a facility and you see folks just in wheelchairs and they're just sitting there kind of like, and they're expressionless and people aren't paying attention to them. They're just whizzing by, trying to be focused on what they need. Look at the interaction, look at the staff. It's not always the most beautiful building that has the best care. So don't be swayed by that either.
Interesting.
The other thing I wanted to and I didn't mention this earlier on the financial piece of this, but Many facilities now are requiring deposits, and they can be pretty hefty. So it's like a buy-in. So a couple sells their home, and then they give a pretty significant portion of that money to the facility as a buy-in. Upon their death or move or what have you, a portion or all that money is refundable. But in the meantime, you've got a significant amount of capital sitting in somebody else's bank account. Wow. So that's something you need to check out as well.
Yeah, that might give you some sticker shock at a pretty emotional juncture in your life. You mentioned ratios. I have no idea. What is a good ratio in a facility like that?
You know, I don't want to quote it off the top of my head. I don't have it in my mind right now, but they are required to have certain staffing ratios for certain patients. So if my mom is a patient who requires 2 people to help her get dressed, then the facility by law should not be accepting her admission unless they have enough people on staff to have 2 people available to help my mom at all times. So that's something that you can easily look that up. I just don't want to misquote it. But it's important when a person requires a higher level of support that okay, there's actually going to be 2 people here to help my mom because she's unable to bear weight or whatever it is.
The other thing I wanted to ask about, and maybe this is going back a little bit more to the parent who's still in their home. As a reporter, I covered so many stories about aging folks who were taken advantage of by scammers who either were contacting them on the internet, over the phone, or in person. But are there, and a lot of the times, those scams were taking place just because the lonely parent was sitting at home and looking for somebody to talk to. We all know the studies that show that your longevity is extended when you have healthy social interactions with other people. If you live in another city, or far another region, and you're not able to be that in-person interaction for your parents, what are other avenues that you can engage if they're not necessarily the most social people?
Well, I think you can. That's a place where in-home care can help out a lot. So just because they don't need, showering or personal care services doesn't mean they don't need companionship. Because as you said, companionship is super vital, and lack of it can be more detrimental than heart disease or diabetes. So that's a place where getting a companion in there and getting someone to keep eyeballs on them is important. But I think it's also important, especially with the scamming issue, is to just keep talking to them about it and just say, hey, Mom, I keep getting calls on my phone and they're talking to me about Social Security fraud, or, I got a call saying that my niece was going to be endangered if I didn't go buy these iPhone gift cards. Have you and Dad ever gotten a call like that? Because what I've found is that people are embarrassed by this. And especially if they get duped, then they don't want to fess up to it because it's like, oh, how could I be so stupid, And they don't want to tell anyone about it. So the more we can make it like this common, like it happens to all of us, right? Yeah. And there's certain times of the year and certain scams that come up on a regular basis that if you know what's current in scam world, you can at least talk to your folks about it and say, and the telephone is set. Most seniors have phones, right? Landlines.
Right.
And most of them, you can just look up Jim Smith and, Southwest Bickner and find out what his phone number is.
Right.
It's so easy. They're such easy targets.
Yeah. And they're available, and they're not always up on the technology. Just going through my mom's voicemails, she'll have like 15 out of 17 voicemails are from people who want to alert her about some kind of Social Security thing. They'll actually call her in Chinese, which is really weird because obviously she is fluent in Mandarin, so somehow they know that as well. Any last thoughts, Kelli, before we go about this topic? I know that you also workshop this issue. You take people through an actual course, right?
I do. We actually, one of the things I've struggled with is how do I make this easy for folks? How do I bring together a curated, trusted resource where people can get information? Because so many times you just run down the Google rabbit hole and just end up like no further along than where you started.
Mm-hmm.
So we put together a digital course called the Playbook for Aging Parents. And what I knew when I started to develop this course was that people were going to have questions and they were going to need feedback and help along the way. So we created a private Facebook group called The Silver Lining, and I go live in there each week so I can answer people's questions. They can DM me, but at least it gives them a resource. And if they get stuck, I have a free 15-minute lifeline so that they can raise their hand and I can get on the phone with them and we can hash it out. But I think it's exciting. It's exciting to just open people's eyes, and I just want them to start as soon as they can.
That's awesome. We'll definitely include all of the links to your resources and how to get a hold of you and find out more from you, because I think a lot of the time that's just it. You can create a comprehensive guidebook, but it's not going to speak to every single situation and the nuances of it that somebody may have questions about.
Yep. I mean, every week when I owned my in-home care company, people would call and it's like week after week, month after month, they're just starting to go through it and they have the same questions over and over again with just that little twist.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Kelli, thank you so much for being a resource
Thank you.
and sharing your wisdom with all of us.
Yeah, happy holidays.
You too. And thank you for joining us for this episode of That Expert Show. We will be summarizing all of the main points that Kelli covered in this episode at thatexpertshow.com is where we put our tip sheets with links to previous episodes as well. If you want to check out other topics that we've taken on, you can watch our episodes on YouTube at That Expert Show, and you can listen to us as a podcast as well. I know sometimes that's easier to take the information that way. We are on Google Play, on Apple iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn, all those good places. Between shows, I invite you to connect with me on social media. We're always live on Facebook and Twitter at 11 a.m. on Mondays. We're also on Instagram and IGTV. So drop me a line and let me know how we're doing. Let me know if there's a topic or an expert that you would like me to explore, because that's the whole idea behind That Expert Show. It's where you help run the show.